Okay, just picking up from where Ray left off there. Those funny little thingies down here, these symbols. One is for the Irish Research Council for the Social Sciences. The other is the Irish government, one in the middle. And that's basically where this strand of my research began. Not the green, or the emphasis on green ICT, but on marrying institutional theory and green ICT, or the topics together, because that's where I got the Irish Government Fellowship to conduct a year-long research study on. And that led me to the UK because I had a team of 2 researchers, and we were trawling. We amassed pretty quickly a huge database of articles from practitioner journals and from academic journals right across the social sciences, focusing on the issue of environmentalism or environmental studies, but specifically on this new emergent thing called green IT or green ICT. And pretty quickly we identified that the UK public sector was, for many reasons, considered an exemplar, and what the UK government was doing was very interesting. So it attracted my attention, and being from Ireland, I had been collaborating with Ray. Ray was the special issue editor for the Journal of Strategic Information Systems, special issue on e-government, and I had a paper in that. So I thought
that's the one we lost.
That's the paper you lost, yeah. But was subsequently published, not in the special issue, but in the issue after it, because Ray lost it. So you'd wonder why I'd want him on board as a collaborator on my fellowship. That was part of the fellowship's remit, incidentally, was to generate research linkages. So I asked Ray, would he collaborate and help me gain access to research sites in the UK, which he did. And that's the origins of this particular study. On the other side, I became interested in institutional theory, in my PhD, which I started in 1997 and completed in 2002. And I've published several papers in this area. And over the last year and a half, it kind of morphed into an interest in mechanism-based theory within institutional theory, or mechanism-based explanations. And so I'll say a wee bit more about that in a minute, but just to move things on. The first point there comes in at the end of the paper that I circulated, which is pretty dense. So I'm going to try to unpack it in an entertaining way, because there's lots of kind of dense conceptual strands and angles, I think, embedded in there. But the first thing is, and I came across this paper, and it's a recent piece of empirical research from the relevant climate scientists and eminent, and I think they've purchased, this and other studies on the topic have been published in Nature and Science, whatever. And they found that 1.5 million years ago, the Earth was 2 to 3 degrees warmer than it was today. And the mechanism that explains that high temperature was the amount of greenhouse gases that were aloft in the atmosphere at that time. Now, right at this moment, we have the same volume or concentration of greenhouse gases aloft in the atmosphere, and yet the Earth is 2 to 3 degrees cooler than then. The only difference is, back then, it took basically tens of thousands of years for that concentration of gases to become aloft, whereas in terms of the concentration of greenhouse gases that are aloft presently, have been there and have built up in just round about the last 150 years, which is not a long enough period for the Earth to catch up in terms of its weather systems. and for it to respond and become 2 to 3 degrees warmer. And that has those findings have yet to find their way into the IPCC report. So and into I suppose the human consciousness right across the planet. But that's the stark scenario we face. So we should be doing everything to sort of address it that we can. And the paper argues that governments should lead by example. I draw in the earlier part of the paper on Anthony Giddens to make that argument, and he concludes that governments have a major role to play. Now, just focusing in on the narrow issue of information and communication technologies, right? Again, it's not universally recognised that the public sector, right across the UK, and I suspect right across the developed world, accounts for 35% to 35 to 38% of both the market share in terms of ICT, and certainly, if that's the case, the greenhouse gas emissions that are generated. So that's another factor, and I found in researching this area that I was probably the only academic, or Ray and I were the only academics that were interested in studying this phenomenon. Certainly after attending two of the major UK government conferences outside of people from the IT sector, the universities, IT departments and computer science departments who were interested in IT per se. There was nobody from the social sciences interested in what was happening, or from the business area or e-government space, that was interested in what the UK government was actually trying to do since 2008 effectively. But long before that, since the Nottingham Declaration in 2000, when 200 local authorities got together to make out a manifesto, to do something about climate change from their perspective. But since then, both the OECD and the European Commission have lauded the United Kingdom government for it's what they call an exemplary. It's an exemplar. It's exemplary greening ICT strategy. It's regarded as the only strategy globally that is trying to do something about lowering greenhouse gas emissions caused by government activity. And it's one of the few strategies that is not only trying to do something but actually measuring the outcomes as well. Some governments across Europe have put together programs, but they tend to be piecemeal and not as effective and not as well articulated. So that combination of interesting kind of motivational pieces led us to the study objective. And we wanted to find out exactly what combination of actors, actions, resources, motivations, and routines. We'll see in a minute. I'm talking specifically about mechanisms here. Led to the outcomes that have been observed to date. Now, I have to add a bit of a qualifier here. The strategy hasn't been implemented in full. There are islands of green across the UK public sector, but the strategy is still pretty much in flight for many reasons, which I'll hopefully uncover during the presentation. So we've got institutional theory, we got mechanism-based explanations, which form the conceptual or theoretical element of the study. Now, institutional theory, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is something that originated in sociology or the nexus of sociology and the sociology of organizations. And even on that, you could say, if you went further, there's the new institutional economics, like there's the new institutional theory, and they're all of a piece really, except they take different stances and use different conceptual vehicles to make a point, like transaction cost theory in the new institutional economics would be kind of the mainstay. Agency theory would be another theoretical strand. In institutional theory per se, you have the old institutionalism perspectives, and you'd have the likes of Philip Selznick being active there, and the new institutional theory, or neo-institutionalism. And there, as I said, there is no theory here. It's mainly a rich theoretical or conceptual framework within which to build theory about society, about societal institutions, about organisations, and about organisational fields. Now, in terms of information systems, or the information system discipline, there is a definitive strand, or I suppose group of researchers identifiable who focus on institutional theory. I regularly review for MISQ, for ISJ, and for JAIS, and so on this topic. So it is alive as well, and so it's and it's also a theme or topic that you'll find in everything from Administrative Science Quarterly right down to the Academy of Management Review, the Academy of Management Journal, and so on. So it's organizational studies, organizational science, and so on. So there's lots of interest in institutional theory, and there are different strands to it. However, at its essence, it's about how regulative processes, as laws and rules, and so on, and normative systems, and cultural cognitive frameworks shape not only societal fields and one step below organizational fields, but also organizations, social groups, and individuals. So there are different layers or levels of analysis that one can take when applying institutional theory. And I'll explain those in flight in a minute. So in the process of institutionalization, according to Richard Scott, who would be kind of the granddaddy of institutional theory in some ways, generalized models like beliefs and norms. Beliefs would be cultural cognitive. Norms would be normative. Menus and scripts would belong to the cultural cognitive pillar. And rules and so on flow down through the various levels carried by socialization, social construction, and sanctioning powers. Now, socialization would straddle the normative and the cultural cognitive side. Social construction, the social construction of reality, constructionism, Berger-Luckman, for example, would be on the cultural cognitive pillar. And the sanctioning powers would come from the regulative or the coercive strand. And in some ways, if you look at any piece of research, deep down they'll be focused on one of those pillars and maybe drift across maybe all three in other ways. For example, economics typically occupies the regulative strand because where it's coming from. It assumes things like, rational actors, utility maximization, and so on and so forth. Agency theory with its emphasis on moral hazard and opportunism and all that sort of thing. The third theme here is that this concept of precipitating jolts tends to change things. In 2007, 2008, we had a precipitating jolt that was the crash, the financial crash, the financial crisis. And that has changed, or should have changed, financial institutions significantly, but it hasn't a whole lot. We've been promised regulation right across the UK and Ireland and Europe and the US, but it hasn't happened. And we have the very entities that should be regulated now causing havoc in terms of the global financial markets. So that's a jolt that will change things. And these precipitating jolts can be social. As we saw in North Africa with the various revolutions over the past year and a bit, whether it's Egypt or Tunisia or Libya, and now in Syria, you have social movements taking place, looking for political freedom and political rights. Technological, we've all seen that since the rise of the internet and on into Web 2.0 or whatever it's 3.0 now, maybe on the verge of it, and social networking technologies. Our regulatory sources, like particularly laws, are brought in that lead to, number one, the deinstitutionalization of existing structures, social structures, and processes, and ways of doing things in society. And if you take any of the Arabic countries at the moment, they've gone through deinstitutionalization, Libya being the latest example. They're now in a phase of pre-institutionalization where they're going to have to institutionalize new structures and new policies to govern the emerging society. And then on to semi-institutionalization. In pre-institutionalization, incidentally, in the context of this study, it occurs within an organizational field that incorporates organizations, in this case the public sector, but it could well apply to private organizations and companies. For example, the organizational field of information technology would include the likes of Hewlett-Packard and IBM, software companies like Microsoft and Cisco, and all of their suppliers right across the supply chain going back into China, who don't appear on the Intel Inside. It also incorporates, as an organizational field, all of the other stakeholders, the investors in those companies, the governments who regulate their activities, their customers, their clients. So their organizational field can be described, or any organizational field can be described as a matrix of actors, groups and organizations who share a common purpose in terms of the organizations actually as the dominant players in the organizational field, but so do their suppliers, and so do their customers, and so do the other stakeholders. And in pre-institutionalization within a field, it's in reaction to some precipitating jolt, where you have some players who look for innovative solutions to particular problems. In semi-institutionalization, through the process of diffusion and network collaborations, those concepts or ideas that were the primary innovations are now dispersed among members of the organizational field, but not completely. You now have dominant organizations taking up those innovations and running with the ball and spreading it, and spreading those ideas, those concepts, until you reach the stage, if you ever do, of full institutionalization, where the entire organizational field has adopted the innovations and is now practicing, say for example, right across a particular sector, that could be implementing social networking technologies to do business as a way of sales and marketing, as a way of customer relationship management, and so on. But there will always be some other precipitating jolt that will change things again before full institutionalization sets in, I think. But a lot of theorists operate from the pretty refined theoretical perspective of assuming that, that there are such ideals and there is fully institutionalized organization. And institutionalization is typically understood or associated with, I suppose, the status quo, with a reluctance to change, with social inertia, which doesn't really happen in reality. I'm way behind time. Okay, what are social mechanisms? Social mechanisms first appeared on the horizon after the Second World War in a big way in the works of Merton, which is well publicized at this stage, but also in the work of Philip Selznick. I had his book for years, TV and the Grassroots, which he studied at Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States. And as at the end, he talks about commitment as a mechanism for change, for institutional change, and co-optation, which means bringing other elements into the organisational matrix in terms of achieving organisational ends. But the mechanism-based approach, whether it's in sociology or whether it's in organisation studies, is a response to the kind of statistical modelling approach. We have correlation between antecedent and dependent variables. It tries to unpack the black box that is the hypothesis and explain why this relationship exists. We all know that taking strychnine, for example, will kill us, so we don't take strychnine. But, you know, until scientists were able to discover the mechanisms, the chemical mechanisms by which strychnine actually restricted oxygen to the brain and eventually killed, well, typically the rat who was getting strychnine, but quite often human beings who were poisoned, did we not understand the mechanism. And right across biology and the sciences, they have been using mechanism, or the concept of the mechanism, to explain the relationship between cause and effect. Whereas in sociology and in organisation studies, we implicitly employ mechanisms without recognising what they are. But quite often we're just happy enough with variance studies rather than process-based studies, which might uncover the mechanisms that explain the means and the ends and the origins of social action. So a mechanism could be explained in terms of actors, the problems that they face, the habits, routines that they employ to solve those problems, and the resources that they draw upon to do so. And that comes from a recent paper by Gross. Hedstrom is probably the current, although he's been criticised, leader in sociology in the whole mechanism-based movement. And he describes it as a constellation of entities and activities that are organised in such a way that they regularly bring about a particular type of outcome. And Campbell here comes from organisational studies. You can see what he says about mechanism-based theorising. And Davis and Markey publicised their piece in Organisational Science in 2005. And again, they're all arguing for sort of more mechanism-based explanations. Okay. Now, what am I trying to explain using institutional theory and using mechanism-based explanations? This conception of the three effects of information and communication technology in terms of the greening of organisations, or as we'll see later on, making them more energy efficient, has direct or first order effects, enabling or second order effects, and systematic or third order effects. Now, in a nutshell, because I have a table that comes up later on, the first order effects reflect the manufacture. Number one, the manufacture of ICT. This is an Apple iPad. It's manufactured according to the regulation on hazardous substances in the EU. Also, there's a similar regulation in South Korea, another one in China, and some states in the US have also implemented regulations on hazardous substances. So this machine cannot contain cannot contain any mercury, for example, and can only contain certain amounts of other controlled metals and substances which are found by and large to be either carcinogenic or damaging to the environment, because these things have tended to end up on landfills and they degrade, and the chemicals leach into the water tables, which end up in somebody's water supply, and so on and so forth. They also consume energy, and in producing them, they consume energy, both in terms of the manufacturer and the supply chain. So that's one of the direct effects. The other direct effect is in consumers adopting and using. We all look for one of these things, whether it's a notebook, or a laptop with the longest battery life. And those things tend to be more expensive, but they're also more energy efficient. And organizations have only recently realized that the computer-based systems cost them a lot of money to run. They were always only focusing on what it costs to buy and maintain. But now they realize that they consume a lot of power, and therefore the other direct effect is in designing these things or adopting IT devices such that they have a lower energy footprint. Enabling our second order effects basically would be green information systems. They help organizations do things like route planning to minimize on petrol consumption. Help organizations who have long supply chains source goods at the or source goods and have them shipped by the most economical and energy efficient route. And the third are systemic effects relate to human behavior patterns. But again, we'll see some more tangible examples for that. Now, one of the arguments within the mechanism-based approach is that we must have a theory to help explain what we're going to see empirically. And we generated this empirical model, which just puts the various elements together. First of all, we have the green ICT outcome effects, which I've just outlined. Here's the actors and the agents within the organisational field of the UK public sector that we were interested in. At a very basic level here, we have micro mechanisms, we have meso mechanisms, and macro mechanisms. And at a micro level, we all have beliefs about the world, or about what we expect from the world, or about our area activity. And our beliefs at home may not be the same as our beliefs at work. We have desires, which are related to those beliefs, and we seek opportunities to take action based on those. And these micro mechanisms, right, just do not exist within the individual. It recognizes that we're connected in a network of social connections, and so our beliefs and our desires are shaped by interacting with other people. So, in speaking to our interviewing managers in the field, in the UK public sector, I would have been conscious of the fact, I was really interested, do these guys believe, are they really concerned, or what's the desire? Is it just an organisational role that they're playing, or do they actually believe that they are helping the environment and want to do so and desire to do so? And these micromechanisms lead to the generation of various meso-level mechanisms. Like political opportunity structure would be a particular, whether it has sanctions tied into it or not, would be a particular piece of legislation, okay, or a statute. It could, in an organisation, be a particular rule or obligation, which may carry with it sanctions, and a sanction has a coercive mechanism. In other words, it forces people to do things that they might not otherwise do, or forces organisations to do things that they might not otherwise do. Strategic leadership, or it's also called institutional entrepreneurship, and network cultivation are two normative mechanisms. And when I say normative mechanisms, is they don't carry the rule of law. The sanctions are not, spelt out in a contract or in a service level agreement or whatever. And it simply refers to the written or unwritten rules of behaviour that we're expected to behave in a certain way. If you join a professional body or society, if you're an accountant, you're expected, because you're a member of that professional organisation, to adhere to its rules of citizenship, its code of practice. If you derogate from that, you can be kicked out, and maybe that's coercive in a way. But generally speaking, industry standards bodies, whether it's typically in unregulated areas, like telecommunication standards, right? When they're adopted, they have no rule of law. companies who manufacture to those standards do so because they're part of a community and they contribute to those standards, but they can go away and follow another standard if they so wish. The concept of strategic leadership is that, you know, if you have an organization or part of or member of an organization feel innovating in a certain way, they're seen as being either a dominant organization or somebody to follow. They're bringing the whole field in a particular direction. Amazon perhaps might be one example, where it started off selling books, brought the whole publishing industry in a particular direction. I know everybody wants to follow on with its e-readers and so on and so forth, and it's branched out in other directions. Network cultivation is where you look at the business model for any organization, and you will find within that business model, if you map it out using Osterwalder's model at least, you will find a network of participating companies and partners and so on and so forth. So network cultivation is very important. And they do that through industry associations of all hues. Mimetic mechanisms or cultural cognitive mechanisms, you know, are more subtle, are more nuanced, and yet in many ways they're the most powerful. Why do we wear the style of clothes we wear? Why do kids have, you know, you walk around the campus there, or any campus, you see over time different hairstyles? That's the emergence and spread of those hairstyles, for example, or modes of dress, you know, are cultural cognitive in their origin and mimetic. People copy each other. They're diffused through, you know, today you could say, you know, for many means, you know, that didn't exist 40 years ago, at least in widespread, like television. 20 years ago, the internet, or less than 20 years ago. And 10 years ago, social networking technologies didn't really exist in a way. So the diffusion of any innovation will take place in a cognitive way. Framing refers, as a mechanism, refers to the way we frame things, or things are framed. And, you know, for example, in terms of climate science, you have the climate skeptics framing the whole issue of climate change as being some sort of figment of the imagination of 98% of the scientists on the planet, which is a bit of a reach. So the way politicians frame issues, the way church leaders frame issues, the way industry leaders and business managers frame issues, either in their publications and strategy documents, or they come on TV and they say things. That's framing at work, framing the issues in such a way that it can be digested. And there's positive and negative aspects to this. Translation refers to the way in which organizations look at what other organizations are doing and translate it mimetically into their organization. Dominant organizations are seen to be doing things better, and you have other organizations in a particular organization field will follow their lead. And bricolage briefly refers to the way in which an organization might innovate around several different ideas to create something new within the organization. And of course, in the face of these pressures, in terms of this study, you can have green ICT outcomes and effects achieved. Okay? But there are problems here, because organizations or members in a field or coalitions adopt legitimizing strategies, which may be acquiescence or compliance. In other words, they agree with what's, and they acquiesce to the powers that be, whether they're regulative or coercive, normative or cultural cognitive. Or they might compromise or avoid, defy or manipulate. You find that if the EU brings out any new policy or law tomorrow on the environment, every interested party will get on board. You'll have lobbyists, and big organizations like Microsoft will get on board, or Cisco or IBM, and they'll try to change that policy. The chemical industry is exactly the same way. Any new law, like the most recent REACH regulation, the regulation on hazardous chemicals. Again, you had industry organisations collectively and individually manipulating the legislators to get the law couched such that it would benefit them or minimise their cost of doing business. So again, in the organisational field of the UK public sector, we would have expected that, you know, a resistance in certain quarters to change. And so that's the reason why this is parked down here. So in a nutshell, in getting to the green ICT outcome effects that we expected to observe in terms of the implementation of the greening ICT strategy, we would have expected to see some or all of these mechanisms at play through the pre-institutionalization, semi-institutionalization, and the full institutionalization phases. And always when we're dealing with individuals, because it's mainly through the real meat came through the conferences we attended, the interviews we conducted, and so on, that the real data was collected. I'll spend 2 seconds on this because I'm way over time. We did a field study, organisational field study, 3 cycles interrelated. Okay, gathered all the documentation and data we could, over 900 articles. I had 2 research assistants working with me, so you know, that to that. They took care pretty much of cycle 1, and cycle 2. I attended 4 conferences, recorded 68 conference presentations. Again, they were targeted. Attended Q&A sessions, again recorded, 9 seminars, all recorded. And then in cycle 3, 11 formal interviews in Manchester Digital Development Authority and Bristol City Council, and 22 informal interviews and discussions from the conferences, and 7 follow-up telephone conversations. So I had a wealth of data there. Now, could I have done with more data? Or could we have done with more data? Yes. But you have to, there is a cut-off point. And we did content and constant comparative analysis in cycling through the data. Okay, stage 1, the precipitating jolts, right, and deinstitutionalisation. Well, the first jolt was back with the emergence of e-government and the transformational government policy in the UK. And because it was boom time, and because Labour were in charge, yes, the good side of this, right, the positive side of this is that transformational government was effective, much more effective in the UK than any other EU state. 100% or so we're led to believe by now, but by the end of the decade, of all transactions, transactions could take place online. There are like 4 billion online transactions in the UK every year, 3 billion of which are in the public sector. High level of penetration. The downside of this is it happened in a totally, I won't say unregulated, totally ad hoc way. Any local authority, any government agency, any government department or part thereof that wanted their own system got their own system. There was no thought went into strategically forming data centres that would serve the needs of the local authorities or anything like that. And that led to a proliferation of IT systems that were sucking energy big time. The numbers are staggering. You'll see reference to them in the paper. Really staggering, the number of data centres, the number of servers, the number of comms rooms, right across the public sector. So something had to happen. But the focus was in the environment. From the 90s, from the Kyoto principles, and in 2000 the UK brought in its climate change, its first act in relation to climate change, but after that nothing was really done. Local authorities likewise in 2000 did something with the Nottingham Declaration, but nothing happened until they kind of reoriented themselves in 2005. And then came in 2006, you had sustainability of the government estate, in which the government realises that the government estate, its offices, its plant, were unsustainable. Had to do something about it. And one of the mechanisms it was using at a ground level was using ICT to make it more efficient. Then in 2008 you had the Climate Change Act and the Energy Act, which focused on greenhouse gas emissions, yes, but on energy efficiencies, because it's not generally recognised in the UK your power plant are out of date. Your energy needs are not being met and will not be met unless you do something really innovative and fast. That's the background to that. Really, the government didn't give a fig about the environment. It just wanted to get people's energy consumption patterns down and down fast. But in terms of its own initiatives, it brought in this mechanism, this political opportunity structure mechanism, as we're calling it, of the Greening Government ICT strategy, in which it made clear its objectives in terms of greening government ICT. So it brought in structures and actors, the CIO Council, Chief Technology Officer Council, and as the mechanism of the structural mechanism for delivery, the Green ICT Delivery Unit. And of course, it had to put in place other mechanisms in order to drive this forward, and the primary mechanism was the Green ICT scorecard, which was a list, and you'll see a table at the back of the paper I distributed, as a list of things that CIOs had to implement. It was a mechanism of diffusing the strategy at a practical level, right? And it also incorporated a monitoring mechanism for monitoring the performance of the CIOs. And the CIOs come from individual councils, like the Hillingdon Borough Council here, the Bristol City Council, the Manchester City Council, to the CIOs in every government department. They all have to, or had to, adhere to the scorecard with this objective in mind. And I won't read it, you can see it there. Now, this is a strategy. I'm not going to go through the various elements because I don't have time. You can read it. And this is the scorecard, ditto. And everything was going along tickety-boo. But, like, again, you have this notion of recalcitrance, the slow-moving public sector entity, you know, that had to change its practices, and the Labour government weren't up for it because they were in their dying days. And of course, you had a financial crisis and then a change of government. And the response to that was the Government ICT Strategy 2010. And it came from a Conservative government, but I'm sure balanced by the Lib Dems in terms of the emphasis here. But it wasn't green anymore. It's the Government ICT Strategy which had green as one strand. But it was true, you know, if you'll see here, it actually, if you look at any of these concepts like cloud computing, the public sector network strategy, that's the infrastructure that carries the data across the public sector, the data center strategy, the government application store are all about consolidation. They're couched in the language of cost saving, but ultimately that's what they'll deliver too. And the little quote there from the last piece that came from at the last conference I attended and taped and transcribed it, that's what he said. We squeezed, and he had a little kind of graphic up, and there was a little tap in it, I remember it, and he had if we squeeze this tap and bring in green ICT, we will save money, around 15 billion quid's worth. And again, in the paper, you see the breakdown of where they expect to see the big savings in the coming years. You can actually see them there. I forgot that I had them up there. But this, you know, I see this, so we interpret this as a reframing mechanism. It reframed the whole thing. And the G-Cloud is an example. But here, if you look at the government cloud, which is a response to the type of efficiencies that can come from a cloud computing model of doing business, that didn't spring out of thin air. IBM, Accenture, Hewlett-Packard, EMC, and Capgemini, you find the industry players who all incidentally have a big vested interest in this, but it's a win-win scenario, so they say. But the Japanese G-Cloud and the US G-Cloud were also influential, as was thinking within the EU, and it's a lot tighter than you think. So where you have in excess of 200,000 servers, they actually don't know. They won't tell people how many servers they have because they don't know. It's in excess of 200,000 and over 10,000 applications. And if you think that's difficult to think, Citigroup, confidentially, have around 80 to 90,000 applications running globally. They have money to burn, except it's our money. Anyway, they want to get them down to 10 to 12 data centers. Okay, and the revenue commissioners have a 13 machine strategy that will reduce 600 applications to 150. That's a very unusual figure, right? 65% of ICT management, etc., is outsourced to just 8 companies at present. IBM, Hewlett-Packard, Accenture, Capgemini, same actors. However, in this new strategy, they want to make space for the small to medium-sized enterprises to get back and get into the game, because what they want to bring in is open standards and open source in order to cut costs. And open standards will allow more competition in the marketplace, and will hopefully that will make things more cost effective and ultimately green. So in terms of outsourcing, the coercive mechanisms are what are called first order mechanisms, because they're practitioner phrased or oriented, and developed in-house. The Green ICT tool and the Green Ticks campaign are all documents or approaches that local authorities and government departments can use to evaluate suppliers. These ones concern the past 2050, concerns greenhouse gas emissions, and EPEAT is a standard. EP goal, for example, would be the #1 standard for computers and electronic devices. So, if you're procuring from government at the moment, you're expected, to have your procurement contract be drawn up according to these guidelines. But the exemplar here is the Environment Agency, which wants effectively to outsource everything in terms of IT that it's got, except for the planning and strategy management. And it's doing it with Capgemini. And I've met at least 5 of the actors involved over the last 2 years. And they seem to be pretty genuine about what they're doing. And they have a green maturity model that they developed with Capgemini, and they're now getting the results of their work actually implemented into one of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard for procurement, not only for the public sector, but because the private sector, through the cloud and so on and so forth, is now procuring a lot more of its IT services from vendors and service providers. They hope to have it apply there as well. And these are the areas where are the criteria by which any procurement contract is evaluated. This is particularly important. ISO, these standards, there's a whole raft of environmental standards out there that supply chain operators are mandating. There are mechanisms, right, to enforce adherence to various environmental criteria. Everything from ethical work practices to child labour, right up to hazardous substances, because the supply chain today is so long and it's like a cloud. They don't know where the stuff is coming from ultimately.
Questions, Tom?
Huh?
Questions?
I have to provide some answers first. 2 seconds, right? I'll finish off, right?
I think we'll leave.
You'll see in the section on the greening of local government that before the government policy came in, there was a lot happening in this space. And what we observed in Manchester City Council and Bristol City Council certainly didn't come from the UK government. It came from their network cultivation mechanisms that they developed through the Core Cities Group in the UK and through the European Digital Alliance, whatever, and our Green Digital Charter. I've mentioned 3 UK cities that are involved, but there's Stockholm and Helsinki and Amsterdam and Ghent and a few others. And what's happening here in these groups is more normative than regulative. They don't, they're not expected or mandated legally to belong to these groups, they did so voluntarily. And what I found, speaking to people in Manchester and Bristol, was the degree of information they shared in terms of best practice in emulating each other, mimetic mechanisms here at play. And here's their good, for the want of a better word, good citizenship charter in terms of the Eurocities Green Digital Charter. And there's a lot happening here in this space. And there's a lot happening in Bristol and Manchester that is not all about the county council making itself greener. It's about empowering citizens as well. And these people actually believe, the civil servants involved, actually believe that they're doing good. But more than that, because local government in the UK is actually local government compared to what it is in my home country. It actually is local and it is government. And if you have complaints about it, come live in Ireland for a while. I mean, they can do things because they gather taxes locally and they can, expend those taxes. But the political influences, we've heard about Labour-dominated councils and Conservative-dominated councils and Lib Dem-dominated councils. Well, these guys actually do make a difference in terms of policy. And that's the reason why some of these councils, and Hillingdon is also mentioned as a case study at the end of the text, as being pretty much exemplars in lots of regards. And here we have them. I'll leave you read it and get on to discussion conclusions. First point is, this thing is pretty slow. From strategic implementation or policy implementation or strategy in 2008 to where we are today, given the supposed urgency of the problem we face in terms of climate change, you'd expect progress to be a lot greater. I think I'll end in this and just talk around everything else. And so I was thinking about, why is this the case? When at the conferences I was attending, public servants tended to be pretty fired up about it. But unfortunately, they were the public servants that I was seeing. There was, tip of the iceberg. The other public servants, the recalcitrant ones, the ones whose beliefs and desires didn't maybe map on to the green ICT strategy because they had jobs to do, perhaps. That meant service provision in terms of ICT or managing the local authority, infrastructure, or just being managers within that system itself. They didn't have the time for the green stuff. It was an overhead and supplemental. And it's exactly the same issues that have surfaced in terms of private sector organisations. It was only when the government reframed its policy to be cost reduction, and whereas measuring greenhouse gases and energy emissions are way out there, budget issues aren't. You get a budget, and budgetary cuts at 25% from a year ago or more tended to exercise the minds of public servants right across the UK public sector. And yet, essentially, it was a coercive mechanism that forced them, willingly or unwillingly, to adopt green ICT or economise on ICT and engage with programmes, whether it's around server consolidation, whether it's home working. Bristol, for example, want 25% of its workforce to be working from home using teleworking strategies. The same thing applies even in the Ministry of Defence with its various levels of security. So there is a movement right across the public sector. Of course, if they get people out of the offices, they can get rid of the offices, which means that the government estate becomes more sustainable. With the growth of information technology, if they can make smaller data centres, they won't have to build new data centres. If they outsource the data centre, they won't have to build data centres at all. They leave it to somebody else. But if they do that, they need to put in place procurement policies that ensure that their suppliers are actually green. And these are the effects expressed in technical terms as to what the direct effects, the outcomes Not universal, but there are major signs that the type of efficiencies, energy, and greenhouse gas reductions will actually be achieved in some measure. And you have the PC and server procurement, EPIT, energy standards, and the other standards mentioned, desktop and server virtualization, thin clients, one desktop for all the public sector, or at least parts thereof, when every department and local authority had their own desktop, own set of applications, right down to sort of smart meters, because that's the next big thing, the smart grid, energy consumption that's rolling out, and so on. Now, there are two sections in here, what practice could make from our findings and what we as researchers could do in terms, and I was speaking to more, doing research in local government and national governments to see what they were doing in terms of becoming more cost efficient and energy efficient. And doing things like Bristol City Council did, for example. They got funding from the Carbon Trust and measured the ICT footprint of Bristol and engaged with industry in Bristol to have them lower their energy footprint and from that the greenhouse gas footprint. But ultimately, if they're saving energy, well, they're saving money. They can lower their cost of operation, whereas the city council or the organisations they're engaging in. And how they did this was network diffusion or network cultivation mechanisms to diffuse best practice. And the final point, cutting to it, this whole iron law of climate change, which states that when in recessionary times like we are at the moment, are going to be shortly again, that concern with climate change goes out the window. Well, if you reframe it in terms of cost saving, you can achieve both objectives. Thanks very much. There was a lot to get through and I didn't do a good job, so I apologise for that. And there was very little time for questions unless somebody wants to stay on. Thanks.